A slight unease washed over Carter as he stepped onto the airplane. The lights along the aisle flickered with typical fluorescent inconsistency, but it felt different this time. He tried to shake off the feeling that he was being watched from corners he couldn't see. He checked his boarding pass, made sure he was in the correct row, and settled into his seat. Even before the plane took off, he couldn't help noticing that the seat next to him was empty. Though the flight appeared to be nearly full, he glanced around, searching for any last-minute arrivals who might occupy that space. But no one appeared. He briefly considered moving closer to the window on the other side of his row, but something about that empty seat felt strangely compelling, as though it was meant to stay unclaimed. He ran through a mental list of everything he needed to do once the plane landed: check into his hotel, call his sister, confirm the next day's schedule. Yet he couldn't concentrate. He kept turning his head toward the empty seat, fighting the odd sense that he wasn't alone. It felt as if someone might show up at any moment to claim it. A flutter of anxiety made him reach for the in-flight magazine, hoping to distract himself with airline articles and seatback advertisements. He flipped through pages on exotic destinations, the latest credit card promotions, a short profile on the plane's new entertainment system. None of it stuck in his mind. It felt like an old habit that offered no real comfort. He noticed the flight attendant moving down the aisle, greeting passengers with an unwavering smile. He mustered a nod when she looked his way. She paused just long enough to see if he needed anything, but he shook his head. She continued, and he watched her greet an elderly couple who seemed excited about their trip, then a man who looked impatient and was tapping his phone screen, possibly finishing some last-minute work emails. Carter wanted to focus on the bustle of other travelers. Usually, observing people helped calm his restless mind. He would study their behavior, imagine their backstories, guess which ones were seasoned flyers and who was bracing for turbulence. But this time, he found his eyes drawn inexorably back to that vacant seat. People settled in. Overhead bins slammed shut. He wondered if that seat would really remain empty. Maybe someone was connecting from another flight and running late. He tried to push that thought from his mind and focus on the hum of the aircraft's engines as they powered up. The overhead lights blinked. A slight adrenaline rush coursed through him, that familiar reminder that every flight carried a sliver of risk. Maybe it was just the tension of traveling, or maybe it was because he felt on edge ever since hearing last week's news story about a commercial plane that made an emergency landing after experiencing a bizarre electrical failure. The passengers' testimonies of flickering lights and strange phenomena had circulated briefly in the local press before the airline dismissed them as a routine mechanical incident. Still, Carter couldn't help imagining similar events happening here. The pilot's voice crackled through the speakers, greeting everyone aboard, listing the flight number and the expected arrival time. Carter took a breath, fastening his seatbelt a bit tighter than usual. He noticed the flight attendants performing their safety demonstration, pointing to exits, demonstrating the use of oxygen masks. The usual script. He tried to focus on their routine to distract himself, but his mind kept drifting back to that seat. It was right next to his, yet it felt like there was an invisible barrier around it, a silent presence that filled the space. He thought perhaps it was just an overactive imagination triggered by sleepless nights. He had been working hard lately, and the flight came at the tail end of a busy week. He found himself swallowing dryly, wishing he had a glass of water. No one came to claim that seat during takeoff, and the plane roared down the runway. The force pressed him back against his seat, vibrations shaking the cabin. He steadied his nerves by gripping the armrest. In the corner of his vision, he swore he saw a flicker of movement on the fabric of the seat next to him. It was probably just the overhead light playing tricks on him, or the reflection of some passenger's phone screen, yet it was enough to quicken his pulse. When the wheels lifted from the ground, the jolt was replaced by the smooth sensation of ascent. Los Angeles disappeared beneath the wings, and a hush settled in as the flight smoothed out. The seatbelt sign remained on, but people started to relax. Carter decided to distract himself. He pulled his phone from his pocket, switching it to airplane mode, and browsed through his downloaded messages. One in particular caught his eye. It was from his sister Linda, reminding him to take care of himself. She had been worried about him since the breakup he went through 2 months ago. He typed a reply he couldn't send until landing. A brief reassurance that he was fine, although he knew better than to lie. He felt untethered from his usual sense of security. Maybe that was why the presence of an empty seat was affecting him so intensely. He wanted to be alone to process his thoughts, but simultaneously feared loneliness. He pressed the phone against his thigh and closed his eyes. A quiet voice from the row behind him drew his attention. Two individuals were quietly discussing something about an unusual flicker in the cabin lights. He heard the voice of a woman, calm yet uncertain, telling her companion that it was probably nothing. Carter pretended not to listen, but he couldn't help tuning in to any sign that his own uneasy feelings were shared by others. A quick glance overhead confirmed that the lights were on, normal, stable. Still, he felt that twinge of energy in the air, like the calm before a heavy rainstorm. He decided to pass a bit of time with the in-flight entertainment system. He flicked through options for movies, TV shows, documentaries, but his eyes kept drifting to that seat, which seemed to loom ever larger beside him. He rubbed his palms against his jeans, trying to ground himself. Then, with a determined sigh, he tapped on a random movie he'd never heard of, hoping it would keep his eyes forward and his thoughts off that intangible dread. About half an hour into the flight, the attendants came around with drinks. Carter asked for a ginger ale, something he found soothing. The flight attendant who handed him the can and plastic cup gave him a polite smile, then glanced curiously at the empty seat. He wondered if she was about to make a comment. Instead, she moved on to serve the passenger across the aisle. He cracked open the can, but the hiss seemed unnaturally loud, echoing in his ears. He sipped slowly, letting the sweet, fizzy taste focus his mind on something tangible. He saw the flight attendant continue down the aisle, and from the corner of his vision, that seat remained starkly unoccupied. It wasn't unusual for a seat to go unfilled, yet it set him on edge. He nearly laughed at himself, amazed by his own nerves. If he weren't so tired, he suspected he wouldn't care so much. A sudden patch of turbulence rattled the cabin. Carter's cup nearly slipped from his grasp. Passengers let out small gasps. The seatbelt sign flashed back on, though no announcement was made. Carter glanced out the window across the aisle. Night sky, a scattering of stars, the wing lights blinking red and white. He steadied his breathing. He was about to tell himself it was just a normal bump in the flight, but then he saw a flicker in his peripheral vision. It came from that seat. He whipped his head around, but there was nothing. Just the worn blue fabric, no sign of movement or occupant. His heart thumped. He looked around to see if anyone else had noticed anything. Everyone seemed busy with their own distractions. He reminded himself that flights had quirks. The overhead lights might flicker, the screens might glitch, the seat next to you might remain empty. But that feeling continued to claw at him, the sense of being observed. No rational explanation could soothe the primal alarm that tingled on the back of his neck. He drummed his fingers against his tray table, thinking maybe he should talk to someone. But what would he say? That he was scared of an empty seat? He stood up, telling himself he just needed to stretch his legs. He navigated the aisle toward the rear of the plane, where the lavatories were located. As he passed each row, he observed the dim overhead lights illuminating faces of passengers reading magazines, flipping through phones, trying to sleep with neck pillows and blankets. Each of them seemed to have a sense of purpose, a plan, or a companion. He felt like he was the only one fixating on something intangible, and that awareness made him feel more isolated. In the cramped space outside the lavatories, he paused. A tiny overhead light flickered. He rubbed his temples and drew a deep breath. The air smelled faintly of disinfectant. The door to one lavatory opened, and an older gentleman in a cardigan stepped out, offered him a polite nod, and squeezed past him. Carter slipped into the now vacant lavatory and locked the door. The fluorescent lighting was harsh, making his reflection look pale and gaunt. He splashed a bit of water on his face, trying to recenter himself. He told himself he was stressed, exhausted, letting his imagination run wild. But as soon as he closed his eyes, he saw a faint outline of a shape next to him, waiting, leaning in closer. He snapped his eyes open and whispered under his breath that he was just imagining things. He pressed his forehead to the mirror, letting its cool surface calm the heat of his anxiety. Then he dried his face, took one more steadying breath, and returned to his seat. And there it was again, that empty seat. Nothing about its appearance had changed, yet he felt like it was mocking him, daring him to look away. He sat down, buckled up again, and tried to watch the remainder of the movie he had selected earlier, but he found the storyline impossible to follow. Time dragged on. The plane's cabin grew darker as the overhead lights were dimmed for those who wanted to sleep. Some reading lights remained on, forming small pockets of brightness. He heard the muffled sounds of a crying baby somewhere near the back, the faint hum of conversation. He leaned his head back against the seat, closed his eyes, and told himself to rest. Maybe if he drifted off, the flight would pass more quickly, and he could put this nonsense behind him. A half-sleep overtook him, somewhere between a doze and a dream, and in that state, he thought he felt the seat shift beside him. He jolted awake, his heart hammering, eyes shooting toward the empty seat. Still empty. He saw no one, but the faint impression of movement lingered in his mind. He pressed the call button for the flight attendant, then canceled it. He had no idea what he would even say if she arrived. He pictured her polite smile turning puzzled if he tried to explain he felt something in an empty seat. He noticed that the woman seated across the aisle from him gave him a curious glance. She had a warm expression, perhaps in her late 30s, with a novel open on her lap. She seemed concerned by his startled reaction. He offered her a reassuring smile, or tried to, then turned away. He leaned forward, elbows on his tray table, and tried to calm himself. That intangible sensation that the seat was occupied, that eyes were on him, wouldn't leave him alone. Eventually, the flight attendant came by again to collect trash. Carter quietly asked if the seat was supposed to be taken. She shook her head and said it was an open seat, but sometimes last-minute passengers boarded. He nodded, knowing that the door had closed long ago. Then he asked her, in a half-joking tone, if anyone had reserved an invisible ticket. She laughed politely, but the look in her eyes suggested she sensed he was more worried than amused. She simply moved on, leaving him with the stale remains of his ginger ale. In his peripheral vision, he spotted the woman across the aisle still watching him. She gave him a small, tentative smile. He managed a slight nod. After a moment, she spoke softly across the aisle, trying not to disturb others who might be sleeping. "Are you all right? You seem a little on edge," she said. Her tone was gentle, genuinely concerned. He turned toward her, grateful for the human connection but also embarrassed. "I'm just not a great flyer," he lied. "It's nothing." She closed her book and leaned closer. "I get it. Flying can be nerve-wracking. Let me know if you need anything. I'm Tracy, by the way." He introduced himself and thanked her, unsure how much to reveal. Should he admit he felt spooked by an empty seat? He decided against it. Instead, he asked if she was heading home. She told him she was traveling for a business conference. The conversation lulled, and she reopened her book, letting him know she was available to talk but wouldn't push it. Carter turned to look out the window, hoping to lose himself in the midnight skyline. Clouds shrouded everything below. Minutes later, he noticed a small shimmer on the empty seat, like the reflection of a passing light. He tried to pinpoint the source but saw only the overhead reading lights. He tried to convince himself it was a reflection of Tracy's reading light. Then a disturbing notion settled in. What if the presence he felt wasn't just in his mind? What if it was real? A slight chill whispered down his spine. He checked the seatbelt sign overhead, half hoping it would be off so he could pace the cabin again, but it remained illuminated. Another pocket of turbulence shook the plane. The pilot's voice emerged from the speaker, calmly announcing that they were expecting some turbulence for the next half hour or so, advising everyone to remain seated. Carter pressed his head against the seat, closed his eyes, and tried to focus on slow, deliberate breathing. His mother once taught him that technique to handle anxiety. He inhaled for 4 counts, held it for 4, and exhaled for 4. It helped a little, but the restlessness in his thoughts refused to vanish. Time crawled by. Occasionally he dozed, only to jolt awake feeling a presence at his side. The repeated cycle made him more exhausted and jumpy. An hour must have passed, and still, the seat was empty, never claimed. Tracy dozed off with her book against her chest, and most of the cabin was dark except for a few scattered reading lights. The crying baby had quieted, replaced by the plane's ambient hum. He began to feel that maybe he would endure this flight in perpetual tension, waiting for the moment that seat was claimed by the intangible occupant in his nightmares. Then he felt something, a gentle press against his arm. At first, he thought it was his imagination or that he had shifted in his sleep. But this felt real, like the slightest brush of fabric against his sleeve. He tensed, turned his head slowly, and saw nothing. The seat belt lay neatly across the seat, undisturbed. Yet his pulse roared in his ears. Every fiber of his being insisted that something had touched him. Goosebumps raised on his arms, and he had to fight a surge of panic. He clenched his teeth, breathing through a wave of dizziness. He considered speaking to one of the flight attendants, or maybe even waking Tracy, but he felt ridiculous. He could already imagine the conversation. "I think something is sitting in this empty seat." He had no proof except his own senses, which he couldn't trust at the moment. He did his best to stay quiet, but tension accumulated in his body like a coiled spring. He shut his eyes, counting backward from 100 in an attempt to lull himself into calmness. By the time he reached the low 70s, he started to believe maybe the flight would proceed without further incident. He forced himself to imagine a peaceful beach, a warm breeze, the sound of ocean waves. But just as he began to relax, the in-flight entertainment screen on the back of the seat in front of him glitched. It flickered to life on its own, showing a static image of the airline's logo. Then it crackled, cycling through different channels. Startled, Carter reached up to tap the screen, thinking he might have accidentally brushed it in his half-sleep. The images kept scrolling, paused on a black screen for a second, and then displayed a faint reflection of the seat next to him. His own reflection was visible, but for a fleeting moment, he thought he saw a silhouette next to his seat. The outline resembled a person seated, head angled toward him as though in silent observation. He jerked away, his heart pounding so hard his chest hurt. The screen went black, then resumed the airline's default channel. No silhouette, no sign of anything unusual. He wanted to believe it was a glitch or perhaps the reflection of someone in the row behind them, but he had felt that fleeting contact on his arm. It could not be explained away by a glitchy screen. He stared at the seat again. Despite it being empty, he felt as if it was very much occupied. He glanced around at other passengers, seeking any sign that someone else was experiencing strange phenomena. Everyone looked half asleep or immersed in their own world. He noticed a man about 2 rows ahead who kept rubbing his temples as though fighting a headache, but Carter doubted it was related. He sighed, turning his gaze to his phone, though he couldn't do anything with it mid-flight. He decided he'd try reading something. He pulled a small paperback novel from his carry-on, something he'd meant to start for ages. Maybe immersing himself in a fictional story would chase away these bizarre thoughts. He opened to the first page. Yet every few lines, his concentration faltered, pulling him back to the seat. The feeling that he was being watched intensified. He looked around again and saw that no one else was awake in his immediate row. He closed the book. The words made no sense in his preoccupied state. He sank further into his seat, feeling a chill that wasn't due to the air conditioning. The roar of the plane's engines filled his ears, making him feel disconnected from the rest of the world. He wondered if it might help to talk to Tracy again, but her eyes were closed, and she looked peaceful. He didn't want to disturb her. The overhead sign still indicated seatbelts should remain fastened, so he couldn't walk around easily. He was stuck, forced to confront that silent, haunting presence next to him. He considered whispering something out loud, maybe challenging the emptiness, but the idea alone sent a surge of apprehension through him. If he started speaking to empty seats, he worried he might not be able to stop. His rational mind tried to brush it off, attributing everything to exhaustion. Suddenly, the plane jolted with a forceful shudder, more violent than previous turbulence. His tray table rattled, the seatbelt dug into his hip. Overhead, bins clicked. A few passengers gasped awake. The pilot came over the intercom again, apologizing for unexpected rough air. Carter clenched the armrests, bracing himself, as the plane lurched a second time. Amid the commotion, he thought he saw the seat next to him flicker, as though a shape moved in and out of existence. Darkness threatened to crowd his vision as panic swelled. The turbulence subsided gradually, but the tension in Carter's chest remained. He heard soft weeping from somewhere behind him. It sounded like a young woman, her sobs muffled. Maybe she was afraid of turbulence or had her own personal reasons. Carter tried to ignore it, focusing on his breathing. The in-flight screens displayed the flight's path, a small animated plane inching across the country, accompanied by an estimated remaining flight time of 3 hours and 45 minutes. That stretched before him like an eternity. He wasn't sure if he could endure this sense of dread for that long. He remembered reading somewhere that planes are a microcosm of humanity in a confined space, that sometimes unusual energies or unexplained phenomena manifest in such areas. He had dismissed such thoughts as nonsense, but now he felt less certain. Could an unseen presence really be haunting him, or haunting the plane? He recalled the news story he saw last week about an emergency landing, the testimonies of flickering lights, unexplained voices. He had assumed it was an exaggeration, but now it seemed disturbingly plausible. The flight attendant came by, checking if everyone was okay. She asked him politely if he was all right. He answered with an unconvincing nod. She gave him a sympathetic look, but moved on, assisting a passenger who spilled her water bottle during the turbulence. Carter sank deeper into his seat, rubbing his temples. He felt a headache forming. The stress was taking a physical toll, and the high altitude wasn't helping. With each passing moment, the seat next to him felt more oppressive, as though the empty occupant drew closer. He turned on the overhead light, determined to read or do something. As soon as he switched it on, it flickered twice, then stabilized. He tried to read the novel again. The words blurred. His focus slipped away. He kept replaying the glitch on the in-flight screen, the subtle brush against his arm, the fleeting silhouette. He realized he was trembling slightly, so he gripped his hands together to stop the shaking. There had to be a logical explanation for all of this. Perhaps the seat had a loose spring that shifted or a slight draft from the air vent. The reflection on the screen could have been a reflection of someone else. Rational explanations could exist, though none felt convincing. A soft voice made him jump. It was Tracy, stirring from her nap. She opened her eyes and turned off her reading light. "Is everything okay?" she asked gently. She must have seen the tension etched on his face. He hesitated, then sighed. "I'm not entirely sure." He wasn't sure how much to reveal without sounding unhinged. "I keep feeling like someone is in the seat next to me." She glanced at the vacant seat. "You mean you saw someone?" He exhaled, shaking his head. "No, that's the thing. It's empty. But I keep feeling a presence." He cringed inwardly at how that sounded. "It's probably just my nerves." She studied him for a moment, then nodded with surprising empathy. "Sometimes stress can do that to you. Have you been sleeping well?" He shrugged. "Not really, no. Not for a while. I've had a lot on my mind, personal stuff." She offered a sympathetic half-smile. "I'm not a doctor, but I've dealt with anxiety and insomnia before. It can play tricks on you. If you need to talk, I'm here. Sometimes just talking about it helps." He appreciated her sincerity. He glanced again at the seat. "Thanks. I might take you up on that." He considered opening up further, but the words wouldn't form. Instead, he asked about her business trip. She chatted about her company's product launch, how she was leading a marketing presentation. She spoke with a quiet confidence, and for a few minutes, Carter managed to push away the oppressive sense of being watched. Listening to her speak, hearing her calm voice, grounded him. He asked questions about her line of work, and she answered in detail. Then the conversation trailed off naturally, and she told him she'd try to get more rest before landing. He remained awake, the weight of the night pressing in. Another hour passed, and the plane maintained a steady altitude. Passengers who had woken during the turbulence went back to their movies or tried to sleep again. Carter found himself in that limbo of exhaustion where the body and mind are too anxious to truly rest, yet too tired to function properly. He decided to force himself to watch another movie, anything to distract from that seat. He put on a comedy, thinking laughter might help. He watched the opening credits, tried to follow the jokes, but every time the audience within the film laughed, it felt hollow in his ears. He scanned the cabin to see if any flight attendants were nearby, then noticed an older flight attendant, a man in his 50s, standing near the emergency exit door, looking in Carter's direction. For a moment, their gazes locked. The man's expression seemed unreadable, as if he sensed Carter's unease. Then a passenger approached him, asking for something, and he turned away. Carter felt a sting of embarrassment, certain that this man must think him odd, the way he kept turning around and fixating on an empty seat. He tried to focus on the movie again, but found it impossible to follow the plot. With a resigned sigh, he turned off the screen, feeling restless. He pressed his forehead against the seat in front of him, arms folded on the tray table, as if trying to hide from the oppressive presence. His mind drifted back to the day before, to the argument he'd had with his boss about an unexpected relocation. He wondered if that tension was fueling his anxiety. He remembered a heated conversation with his ex, the words echoing in his head. He had never felt so out of control. And now, on this flight, he was literally suspended in the air, vulnerable, powerless to escape the intangible force gnawing at his senses. He realized that the environment fed into his anxieties. The close quarters, the hum of engines, the knowledge that he was miles above the ground. He closed his eyes, tried to breathe. He felt a subtle shift beside him. His eyes snapped open and he raised his head. The seat belt on the empty seat had changed position slightly, as though disturbed. That was impossible. He stared, not daring to blink. Could it have been the plane's vibrations? He waited, half expecting to see the belt move again. It remained still. Panic welled inside him, so he forced himself to adopt a calm expression. He glanced at Tracy, still resting with her book. No help there. He considered telling the flight attendant, but the rational part of him held back. He could already predict the reaction. Probably a comforting smile and a statement that sometimes overhead fans cause small shifts in seatbelts. He placed his hand gently on the empty seat, feeling the rough fabric. It was cold. He pressed down lightly, testing for any abnormal movement. It felt normal, solid. Then he pulled back, unsure what he expected to find. He clasped his hands in his lap, taking slow breaths. The flight overhead monitors indicated 2.5 hours remained until landing. It felt like an eternity. Eventually, he drifted into a shallow sleep. In that half-awake state, he dreamed of the seat next to him being occupied by a dark figure with no face. The figure leaned toward him, whispering sounds that had no words, only a soft hiss. He jolted awake with a small cry, startling Tracy, who turned to him. He mumbled an apology, wiping cold sweat from his forehead. She asked if he had a nightmare, and he nodded, forcing a feeble smile. She offered him a piece of gum, perhaps to settle his nerves, and turned back to her book. At last, the flight attendant announced that they would be serving a light meal. That distraction brought some normalcy to the cabin. Carts rolled down the aisle, offering sandwiches or snacks. Carter accepted a small sandwich and a bottle of water, grateful for a mundane task like unwrapping the plastic packaging and eating. He noticed he was starving, having eaten little before boarding. The mechanical act of chewing, tasting the bland turkey and cheese, anchored him in reality. He dared to hope that food would stabilize him, warding off the surreal sensations. He took slow bites, occasionally glancing at the seat next to him. The overhead lights had been turned on again so people could manage their meals. His rational mind started to reassert itself. Perhaps everything had just been an overreaction. Exhaustion, stress, a psychosomatic trick. He began to feel more human with some food in his system. He even managed to converse briefly with Tracy about the flavor of the sandwiches, joking that airline meals had improved slightly since the last time he flew. She laughed, clearly trying to support a sense of normalcy for his sake. Then, just as the flight attendant was collecting trays, Carter caught the faintest glimpse of movement in the seat next to him. His heart lurched. It seemed like the outline of a hand reaching for the tray table. But when he turned his head, there was nothing. The tray table was folded up, and the seat was empty. He stifled a cry, feeling the color drain from his face. The flight attendant paused to ask if he was all right, and he stammered that he was, quickly handing over his garbage. She gave him a concerned look, but moved on. He decided he couldn't keep this entirely to himself. Once the attendant was out of earshot, he leaned over to Tracy, keeping his voice low so as not to disturb nearby passengers who might be resting. "I keep seeing things," he admitted quietly, "like something is there one second and gone the next." She set her book aside, turning to him with sincere concern. "I believe you're seeing something," she said gently. "But do you think it could be stress or a lack of sleep?" He hesitated. "Maybe, but it feels so real. I feel like I'm going crazy." She reached out and patted his arm reassuringly. "You're not crazy. We all have moments when our minds play tricks on us, especially under stress. Maybe you should talk to a flight attendant and see if they have any suggestions. Sometimes they have training on how to help anxious passengers." He nodded, though he didn't move. He wasn't sure if talking to the crew would actually help, or if it would invite more eyes on him. He wanted to maintain some dignity. He exhaled slowly. "Thanks for listening. I appreciate it." Tracy offered a smile. "Anytime." The plane soared on. He checked the time, noting that they had barely 2 hours left in the flight. Usually that would be a relief, but in this situation, it felt like a slow countdown, forcing him to remain in this suspended bubble of dread. He tried again to read, to watch a movie, to do anything except think about that seat. Every so often his eyes would flick to it. Each time, it remained empty and unremarkable. Yet a whispering anxiety told him that the seat was anything but unremarkable. He was tempted to stand up and switch seats with someone else, but the flight was nearly full, and besides, he doubted it would help. The presence, if it existed, seemed tied to him, not the seat. He remembered an old family story about his grandmother, who once claimed to see a ghost on a train journey. She insisted the ghost followed her from car to car, though no one else saw it. Carter had dismissed it as a superstition, but now he wondered if there was some truth in her tale. Could some entity attach itself to a vulnerable traveler? He closed his eyes and tried to steady his breathing again. He imagined his sister Linda, her reassuring words, her gentle nudges that he should take a break. He almost laughed bitterly at how correct she was, that he needed a genuine rest, not just a flight across the country to handle more obligations. He realized his exhaustion was more than just physical. He was emotionally drained, carrying guilt from the breakup, tension from work, fear of an uncertain future. The perfect recipe for illusions, if illusions they were. As the flight continued, a hush settled once more. Several passengers seemed to be napping, while others watched movies. The flight attendants quietly circulated, responding to call buttons. The plane's engines droned steadily, and the turbulence had eased. A sense of normalcy slowly returned, at least on the surface. Carter felt lulled into a kind of uneasy acceptance. He told himself to endure, to keep a lid on his fear. But then he noticed something else. The faint smell of perfume wafting in his direction. It wasn't a scent he recognized. It reminded him of old-fashioned powder, the kind his grandmother used. He looked around, checking if maybe a passenger behind him was applying something, or if the air vent was circulating a fragrance. No one seemed to be wearing heavy perfume. The older gentleman behind him was snoring softly, a half-eaten cookie on his tray table. The middle-aged woman next to him was reading an e-book, and he doubted it came from her. Tracy was right across the aisle, and he didn't smell it from her earlier. This perfume seemed localized, as though it emerged from the seat itself. He leaned forward, trying to catch another whiff. It drifted away. A chill crawled up his spine. He turned to the window in the hope of distracting himself, but all he saw was endless black sky. He felt a drop of sweat trickle down his temple. This entire flight was starting to feel like a slow descent into madness. He considered reading the airline's safety card just to occupy his hands with something tangible. The irony was not lost on him. Safety instructions for a situation that couldn't address a haunting presence. He heard a whisper then, distinctly. His name, spoken softly. Carter. He froze, every muscle tensing. He stared at the empty seat, his lips parting, but no sound came out. The whisper was neither male nor female, just a gentle intonation of his name. He looked around quickly to see if any passenger had spoken it, but no one seemed to notice him. The whisper faded. His heart thudded painfully. He wanted to cry out or run, but he was trapped in the seat with a plane full of oblivious passengers. He forced himself to speak, though it was barely above a whisper. "Is someone there?" He felt foolish the moment the words left his mouth. The only response was the low hum of the cabin. His rational mind screamed that this was impossible, that he must be asleep or hallucinating. Yet he knew he was wide awake. He felt the dryness in his throat, the sweat on his palms, the tightness in his chest. This was real to him, whether or not it existed in objective reality. He pulled the airline blanket up, as if that flimsy piece of fabric could shield him from whatever was happening. His thoughts churned. Was it possible that his personal anxieties had manifested in this flight, conjuring an entity that existed solely in his perception? Or was there genuinely something in that seat drawn by his vulnerability? He recalled reading about sightings of apparitions on trains, buses, planes, restless spirits that attached themselves to travelers. He had always dismissed such accounts, but now he had no explanation for his experiences. He considered confiding in Tracy further, but he feared sounding deranged. He considered pressing the call button, but the flight attendant could offer no remedy for a ghostly presence. He sank into a state of hyper-awareness, where every sound seemed amplified. He heard the rustle of clothing, the soft snores, the beeps of the entertainment systems. He waited for that whisper again, or the touch on his arm. He even left his phone's camera open, secretly trying to capture a picture of the seat. But the screen showed only an empty seat. His heart pounded so fiercely that he worried someone would notice how rattled he was. The flight seemed endless, time stretching like taffy. He found himself counting the minutes until landing. At last, a slight change in cabin pressure signaled they were beginning to descend. The pilot announced they were making an early approach due to favorable winds, and landing might occur sooner than anticipated. Relief surged through Carter, but it was overshadowed by his lingering fear. He wondered if the presence would vanish once they landed, or if it would follow him beyond the plane. The idea of stepping off this aircraft with that entity still lurking nearby made him shudder. The seatbelt sign flicked on. Flight attendants prepared the cabin for landing, ensuring seatbacks were upright and tray tables stowed. Carter watched them move like choreographed dancers, calm and composed. He tried to mimic their calm. Tracy gave him a nod, as if silently cheering him on, noticing his tension but not pressing. He appreciated her unspoken support. He sat up straight, fastening his belt securely, following every safety instruction meticulously. The presence next to him felt no weaker, but he clung to the hope that soon they would be on solid ground, and he could escape. The descent was relatively smooth at first. He forced himself to look out the window and saw pinpricks of lights below, a sprawling city beneath the nighttime sky. The pilot spoke again, announcing the weather was clear, that they'd arrive in about 15 minutes. Carter's shoulders relaxed marginally. 15 minutes. He could endure that. He closed his eyes and willed his heart rate to slow. Then the plane abruptly lurched, dropping altitude faster than expected. Passengers gasped in unison, and an alarm chimed in the cabin. Tracy clutched her armrest. Carter gripped his seat. The pilot's voice came over the intercom, reassuring them it was a standard maneuver. But Carter's instincts screamed otherwise. He cast a frantic glance at the seat next to him, and for the briefest moment, he saw the shadow of a figure. He couldn't make out a face, but the shape was there, arms resting on the seat rests. A wave of terror mingled with bizarre relief. He wasn't imagining it. He was seeing something. He shut his eyes, praying silently that they would land safely, that the presence would stay behind. The plane stabilized, continuing its descent at a more controlled pace. The city lights grew larger, the runway lights visible in the distance. Carter's skin tingled with anticipation, every second feeling like an hour. The engines roared, flaps extended, the wheels prepared for touchdown. Another drop in altitude left a queasy feeling in his stomach. A heavy thud announced the landing gear hitting the runway. The plane sped along the tarmac, decelerating with a jolt that sent carry-on items shifting. Passengers exhaled collectively, some clapping softly in relief. Carter's breath caught. Only a few more moments, and he would be free from this seat. The plane pulled off the runway, taxiing toward the gate. The overhead lights brightened, and people began retrieving bags. He remained seated, hands trembling slightly, eyes locked on the seat next to him. It was empty. No outline, no silhouette. Just an ordinary seat with a seatbelt, a tray table, and nothing else. He stood up on shaky legs, gathering his things, avoiding direct eye contact with that seat. Tracy offered him a kind smile, relieved the flight was over. He nodded, giving her a quiet, "Thank you for everything." She seemed to understand and wished him well. The line of passengers shuffled forward. He inched along, glancing back one last time. The seat remained as it was. He stepped into the aisle, feeling the press of travelers eager to disembark. As he made his way through the jet bridge into the terminal, the bright lights and bustling crowds hit him like a wave of normalcy. The presence he felt on the plane didn't accompany him, at least not in any obvious way. He inhaled the airport's air, a mixture of coffee, cleaning product, and stale recycled atmosphere. He found an empty seat near the gate to collect himself before heading to baggage claim. His body shook with a mix of relief and residual dread. He wondered if that presence would return if he took another flight, or if it had been a manifestation of his own mind. He felt certain it was real, yet he had no proof except the memory of that whisper, the fleeting touches, and the silhouette on the screen. He decided to text Linda, letting her know he had arrived. He typed a brief message. "Landed safely. Something weird happened on the plane, but I'm okay. We'll explain later." He hit send and stared at the phone screen, half expecting some glitch or sign that the presence followed him. Nothing unusual happened. The normal bustle of travelers scurrying to their gates or waiting in lines enveloped him. An overhead announcement reminded passengers of local time and baggage claim carousels. Everything felt ordinary, comforting in its banality. He pulled himself together and headed for baggage claim. As he walked through the terminal, he noticed a reflection in the windows that lined the corridor. For an instant, he thought he saw a shadow behind him, but when he turned around, he was alone. He shook his head, blaming it on nerves. Eventually, he retrieved his suitcase and wheeled it toward the exit. The cool night air outside the airport was bracing, a welcome contrast to the stuffiness of the plane. He hailed a taxi and gave the driver the address of his hotel. During the ride, he stared out the window at city lights, trying to process everything that had happened. The calm voice of the driver asking him about his flight brought him back to the present. He muttered a non-committal, "Fine," too wary to mention the real story. He wasn't sure if he believed it himself. He arrived at his hotel, checked in, and made his way to a modest room on the 7th floor. After locking the door behind him, he dropped his suitcase by the bed and collapsed onto the mattress, overwhelmed. The hum of the air conditioning soothed him. He closed his eyes, uncertain if he'd sleep or remain locked in anxious thoughts. Finally, exhaustion won, and he drifted into a restless sleep filled with half-formed dreams of seats that wouldn't stay empty. Morning came with a pale glow filtering through the thin curtains. He jolted awake, sweat-soaked, his heart pounding. He checked the time on his phone. He had a few hours before his schedule demanded him to be anywhere. The memory of the flight flooded back, but in the daylight it felt distant, as if it had happened to someone else. Still, a gnawing sense of unease lingered in the pit of his stomach. He debated calling Linda. He knew she would worry, but he also knew she'd be supportive. At the same time, he feared her reaction. Could he bring himself to describe a phantom presence in the seat next to him? Would she think he needed professional help? Perhaps. Yet the idea of bottling it up felt suffocating. He opened his phone to see if she had replied to his earlier text. She had. "So glad you're safe. Weird how. Call me if you can. Worried about you." He could almost hear her voice in the words. He typed back, "We'll call soon. Need coffee first." Then he forced himself out of bed, showered, and dressed. Under the hot spray of the shower, he tried to rationalize the events as a product of exhaustion. Once ready, he stepped out into the hallway and headed down to the hotel's small cafe. He ordered a large coffee, black, and found a corner table. The buzz of travelers and business people filled the room, a comforting background chatter. He took a sip, savoring the warmth, and felt marginally more human. He took out his phone and dialed Linda's number. She answered on the third ring. "Hey, you. I'm so glad you called. How was the flight?" Her voice held genuine concern. He rubbed his forehead, hesitant. "It was, odd. I'm not sure how to explain. Something felt like it was with me the whole time, sitting next to me in an empty seat." He heard her pause. "Are you saying, like a ghost?" He bristled at the word, but it was accurate. "I don't know. Maybe I was just stressed out of my mind, hallucinating. But it felt real. There were moments it seemed to brush against me or appear in reflections. She made a soft sound of empathy. Carter, you've been through a lot lately. You've barely slept since the breakup and work is piling on. It's possible your mind just conjured up something. But I don't want to dismiss your experience if it felt real. He exhaled slowly. I'm not sure either. It was the creepiest feeling I've ever had. Now that I'm off the plane, I don't sense it anymore. Do you think you need to see a professional? Maybe talk to a counselor? He took another sip of coffee, letting the warmth calm him. I think I might once I get back. If it happens again, I definitely will. For now, I'll chalk it up to exhaustion and stress. But it was terrifying, Linda. I can't shake the feeling something was truly there. She spoke reassuringly. You're safe now. Focus on what you need to do for work and get some rest. Call me whenever you need. He thanked her and ended the call, feeling a bit better having shared it. He finished his coffee in a thoughtful silence, pondering whether he believed his own words. The presence had felt tangible, yet in the bright setting of a hotel cafe, it all seemed like a nightmare. He told himself to stay grounded and remind himself there was no sign of it now. He headed out to the building where his meetings would be. The day passed in a blur of business small talk, presentations, and polite handshakes. He managed to keep his composure, though at times he found his thoughts drifting back to the flight. He forced himself to focus on the tasks at hand. By the time evening came, he was too exhausted to dwell on it further. He ate a quick dinner at a nearby diner and returned to his hotel room. He fell asleep almost immediately, and to his relief, he slept through the night. The next morning brought new energy. He felt a renewed sense of normalcy, as though the horrors of that flight were locked in the past. He reminded himself he had to fly home in a few days, but he tried not to think about it too much. The second day of work obligations went smoothly, and he even found himself making pleasant conversation with new acquaintances. In the back of his mind, the memory of the flight lingered, but it felt less acute. He told himself he might have overreacted. On the third day, he found a voicemail from Tracy, who had exchanged numbers with him briefly after the flight when they were walking through the terminal. She had said, "If you ever need to talk, or if you want to grab coffee, call me." He had almost forgotten giving her his contact. He listened to the message. She sounded hesitant, admitting she felt a little worried about him. She asked if he was doing okay and suggested meeting up if they were still in the same city. He was surprised by her concern and debated calling back. She was staying a few blocks away, attending her conference. After a moment of deliberation, he dialed her number and suggested grabbing a coffee before she headed to her day's events. They met at a small cafe near the convention center. She was seated at a corner table, looking professional in a blazer. When she saw him, she waved and smiled warmly. He slid into the seat across from her, noticing she already had a latte in front of her. "How are you holding up?" she asked, studying his face. He shrugged. "Better than on the flight, I guess. I haven't felt anything strange since I landed. I was pretty shaken that night, but now I'm feeling almost normal." She nodded, sipping her latte. "I was thinking about it after we landed. You seemed genuinely frightened. It wasn't just some mild anxiety. If you want to talk about it, I'm all ears." He leaned back in his chair, exhaling. "I'm still not sure how to describe it. It felt like something was physically there, next to me. I heard whispers. I saw fleeting shapes. But now I'm chalking it up to exhaustion. In the daylight, it seems almost silly." Her eyes filled with understanding. "It's not silly if it felt real. Our minds can do powerful things under stress, but also sometimes there are things we can't explain. Maybe it was a one-time thing. Hopefully you never experience it again." He offered a wry smile. "Well, I have to fly back in a couple of days. I'm hoping that flight will be far less eventful." She tapped her fingers against her cup. "Do you know your flight number yet? I'm actually flying out around the same time. It would be wild if we ended up on the same flight again." He pulled out his phone, checked his itinerary. He laughed in amazement. "Same airline, same day, only an hour after your departure. Close, but not the same one." She nodded, a bit of relief in her eyes. "Probably for the best. Don't want any more cursed flights, right?" He chuckled softly, and they spent a while discussing safer topics, like their respective conferences and upcoming schedules. It felt good to talk with someone who had witnessed a piece of that terrifying experience and didn't dismiss it outright. She believed he had felt something, even if she attributed it to psychological stress. He found comfort in her empathy. By the time they parted ways, he felt lighter, as though acknowledging the fear had lessened its hold on him. As the days passed, he completed his work commitments. The time came for him to head home. He woke early on the morning of his return flight, determined to face the journey without allowing fear to consume him. He arrived at the airport, checked in, and sat at the gate. A nervous tension tugged at him, but he reminded himself that thousands of flights took off every day without incident. When his boarding group was called, he made his way down the jet bridge. As soon as he stepped onto the plane, the wave of anxiety returned. He told himself it was normal, given what happened before. He found his seat, stowed his carry-on, and glanced to see if the seat next to him was occupied. This time, there was already a passenger in it, a woman traveling with a teenage daughter. He almost sighed in relief. No empty seats, no chance for that intangible occupant. He sat down and fastened his seatbelt, feeling a sense of liberation that the seat next to him wasn't vacant. The plane took off smoothly. He engaged in light conversation with the woman beside him, who mentioned they were going home after a vacation. Everything felt ordinary, the flight routine. He even dozed off for a bit, exhausted from a busy week. When he woke, the plane was halfway through the flight, the mother and daughter exchanging a magazine. He realized his heart wasn't hammering, and he felt no sense of dread. He almost laughed at himself for the relief he felt at a normal flight experience. Then, as he stretched and looked around, his gaze fell upon the row behind him on the opposite side of the aisle. He saw an empty seat in the middle. The occupant of the window seat was napping, leaning against the window. The occupant of the aisle seat was flipping through a magazine, but that middle seat was conspicuously empty, and for just a heartbeat, he felt a prick of discomfort. He tried to look away, telling himself not to feed the thought. But something drew his attention back, and in that instant, he caught a glimpse of a blur, like a partial silhouette, flash across the seat. It happened so quickly he couldn't be sure. His pulse spiked. Was it a trick of the eye or something else? He gripped the armrest, fighting the urge to bolt upright. He was on a different plane, a different seat. This had to be his imagination. He forced himself to stare at the seat again, but it looked normal. The passenger in the aisle seat seemed oblivious, humming softly to music only she could hear. He closed his eyes, feeling a wave of nausea. He told himself to breathe. Nothing could happen here. He was not going to let a fleeting vision unravel him. He tried to occupy himself with a puzzle game on his phone. His heart rate gradually returned to normal, but he couldn't completely shake the feeling that he had glimpsed something. As the flight continued, he forced himself not to glance back again. He kept reminding himself of how easily the mind can slip into old fears. When the plane landed, he felt relief again. He walked off into the terminal, telling himself that the flash he saw meant nothing. He pushed it to the back of his mind. The second flight had been largely uneventful. No persistent presence next to him. No whispered name. He exhaled a heavy breath as he entered the arrivals area, hailing a ride home. Life resumed a certain normalcy after that. He returned to work, sorting out projects and duties that had piled up in his absence. His boss was somewhat apologetic about recent tensions, explaining the relocation push had been a misunderstanding. Carter accepted the explanation with a vague sense of gratitude. He felt a renewed appreciation for everyday annoyances, because normal frustrations grounded him in reality. He made an appointment with a counselor just to talk through his anxieties and clarify his experiences. The counselor listened carefully, reminding him that intense stress can lead to vivid experiences that feel real, especially under conditions like sleeplessness and fear of flying. Carter still couldn't entirely dismiss what he felt on that first flight. He searched online for any reference to that flight number having had strange incidents. He found no news articles or ghost stories. Life went on in the outside world, oblivious to the darkness he felt looming on that aircraft. Over time, he began to doubt his own memories, wondering if perhaps it was a dreamlike half-delirium. Weeks turned into months. He traveled occasionally for work, always with a slight tremor of fear at the thought of boarding a plane. but none of his subsequent flights brought anything resembling that presence. He found some measure of peace, attributing the event to a psychological crisis. He kept in sporadic contact with Tracy, who asked about his well-being. They exchanged casual updates, sometimes joking about the plane ghost. He found her perspective reassuring. She'd say things like, "See, nothing else weird happened, right?" And he'd nod and feel a weight lift off his shoulders. Yet the memory never vanished entirely. Late at night, he sometimes woke from a dream where he saw the seat next to him shift. He'd sit upright, heart pounding, recalling that cold brush against his arm, the whisper of his name. He'd switch on a lamp and remind himself it was only a dream. The presence, if it had ever been real, was gone. He tried to bury the lingering fear in the routine of daily life. Grocery shopping, occasional nights out with friends, even a couple of tentative dates. Things gradually returned to a steady state of normal. Then, nearly a year after the incident, an opportunity arose to visit family in another state. He tried to schedule a train or a long drive, but logistics made flying the best option. He booked the flight with a sense of determination, telling himself it was time to fully conquer whatever residual fear remained. He had grown more confident, felt mentally healthier. As he checked in for the flight, he refused to let his mind conjure illusions. Boarding the plane, he noticed the overhead lighting flicker momentarily, but that was hardly uncommon. He found his seat in the exit row, which offered extra legroom. His seatmates were a middle-aged couple who appeared cheerful, chatting about their upcoming vacation. He settled in, telling himself it was just another routine flight. The safety demonstration took place, and the plane taxied away from the gate. As the plane lifted off, Carter stared out the window, marveling at the city shrinking below. He felt that familiar rush of takeoff, part excitement, part nerves, but overshadowed by no unnatural sense. The flight leveled off, and the seatbelt sign was turned off. He breathed a private sigh of relief. So far, so good. When the flight attendants started the snack service, he asked for water and thanked them politely. He was reading a magazine he had picked up in the airport when a new passenger's voice caught his attention. One of the attendants was asking someone to move to a different seat, possibly for a better distribution of weight or to allow a family to sit together. The person agreed, gathered their belongings, and followed the attendant. Carter watched idly, more curious than anything else. They stopped in the row behind him, and the passenger took an empty seat. Carter turned back to his magazine, feeling unbothered. A few moments later, he heard a slight commotion. The passenger who had moved was standing again, beckoning an attendant. Something about a broken seatbelt or a malfunctioning recline. The attendant apologized and said they would look for another seat. Carter noticed the row behind him had one empty seat next to the window. He paused, feeling his heart skip a beat. He recognized that sense of tension, that intangible atmosphere. He tried to dismiss it, telling himself it was just a normal occurrence. The new passenger moved again to a seat further ahead, leaving that window seat empty. Carter forced himself not to look, focusing on the in-flight magazine. But he felt a tightening in his chest. Why did an empty seat scare him so much? Because he remembered. He remembered every cold brush, every flicker of movement. He stared at the printed words in the magazine, reading about top travel destinations, but not absorbing them. Then the lights overhead flickered once, twice, and steadied. He shut his eyes, bracing against any surge of panic. He refused to let it grip him. He breathed deeply, thinking of the counselor's advice. Anchor yourself in the present moment, list objects you see, sounds you hear. He noted the magazine in his hand, the seatbelt sign overhead, the chatter of the couple next to him. Reality. Then from behind him came a faint rustling, as if someone shifted in the empty seat, adjusting the seatbelt. His muscles tensed. He told himself it was the occupant behind him, or something else entirely. He snuck a glance back. The seat was indeed empty. No occupant. Yet the seatbelt lay differently than before. Cold sweat beaded on his neck. He turned forward, squeezing his hands together. He told himself it was a normal shift from the plane's motion, but a creeping dread slithered through him. This was too reminiscent of the first time. Minutes later, a soft whisper brushed past his ear, almost inaudible. He stiffened, feeling the blood pound in his veins. He had heard no words, only a breath of air that seemed to carry the echo of a voice. The couple next to him continued chatting about their vacation plans, oblivious. A flight attendant walked by, checking if everything was in order. Carter wanted to speak up, to say something was wrong, but fear and embarrassment paralyzed him. He forced himself to think logically. He was more mentally stable now, better rested. Could he truly be hallucinating again? If so, it confirmed the presence was born of his own mind. But if it was real, how could it reappear here, on a different flight, a year later? The possibility that something had attached itself to him, that it waited for him in the skies, was too terrifying to contemplate. He hunched over, resting his head in his hands, trying to steady his breathing. The counselor had recommended various techniques. He tried them all: visualization, grounding, counting. None could quell the frigid sensation seeping into his bones. He reached for the overhead light, needing more illumination, but it flickered. He recoiled as though the flicker was an omen. The presence felt stronger, like a weight pressing on his soul. Then a quiet, distinct voice seemed to come from the empty seat behind him. "Why did you leave me?" it asked. It wasn't his name this time. It was a question, haunting and forlorn. He froze, every cell in his body screaming in alarm. He wanted to turn around, to confront it, but dread held him in place. He clenched his jaw, sweat sliding down his temple. The question repeated, echoing faintly. "Why did you leave me?" The couple next to him was oblivious, rummaging through their carry-ons for a snack. Carter felt tears sting his eyes as the voice repeated that question. It sounded close, pained, like someone searching for answers. He muttered to himself, "I didn't leave anyone," trembling as he spoke. The voice fell silent. He half expected the plane to plunge into turbulence or for the seatbelt to shift again. But for a moment, all was still except for his racing heart and ragged breath. He couldn't stay silent any longer. This was beyond a fleeting hallucination. He pressed the call button. A flight attendant approached, a friendly smile in place. She asked if she could help him. He looked at her with desperation. I think there's something wrong with the seat behind me." He realized how absurd it sounded. "I heard something, maybe an electrical glitch with the speakers or something." He fumbled his words, trying to find a plausible explanation. She nodded sympathetically. "Let me check." She walked behind him, inspected the overhead panel. Carter listened as she tested the reading light, the call button. He heard her mention it seemed fine. She asked the passenger in the aisle seat behind him if everything was okay, and the passenger merely shrugged, saying it was all good. The flight attendant returned to Carter. "Everything seems normal. Are you feeling unwell? Could I get you some water or help you with anything else?" He forced a tight smile, mortified at how irrational he sounded. "No, I'm okay. Maybe I just dozed off and heard something in my dream." She patted his shoulder kindly and left. Carter rested his head against the seat, exhaling in defeat. He felt trapped by whatever was happening, forced to endure it alone. He turned his focus inward, telling himself that the presence might feed on fear, that he needed to remain calm. His counselor once said that acknowledging fear without letting it define you can help break the cycle. He tried repeating in his mind, "I see you, fear. I acknowledge you, but you will not consume me." Despite these efforts, the tension remained. He felt sure that if he turned around, he would see something in that empty seat, and he wasn't sure he could handle it. He stayed facing forward, eyes squeezed shut, gripping the armrests until his knuckles whitened. The plane cruised on. The flight attendants continued their tasks, passengers chatted or slept, and the overhead map showed their progress. He realized they still had at least 2 more hours to go. 2 hours seemed an impossible length of time to exist in this heightened state of dread. He forced himself to open his eyes and look at the couple next to him. They were smiling at each other, discussing restaurants they planned to visit. Their normalcy was both comforting and jarring. He focused on their conversation, letting the mundane details of their itinerary drown out his terror. It worked slightly. His breathing slowed and the voice didn't return. Then, out of nowhere, the overhead speakers crackled. The pilot announced they were entering a stretch of rough air. Carter braced himself, expecting the worst. The plane shook with turbulence. Cups rattled. and the woman next to him gripped her partner's hand. Carter closed his eyes, trying not to envision that presence feeding off his fear. The turbulence lingered, dropping the cabin into a roller coaster sensation. People groaned, some crying out softly. For Carter, it felt like a brutal test of endurance. After a few minutes that felt like an eternity, the turbulence eased. People breathed audible sighs of relief. The pilot apologized for the bumpiness. Carter slowly opened his eyes. He told himself the worst was over, but a distinct chill traveled down his spine. He heard the softest whisper behind him. "You can't leave me behind." His eyes stung with tears. He'd done nothing to warrant such a haunting. How could he free himself from a presence that seemed to exist in the folds of his own psyche? With trembling hands, he unbuckled his seatbelt, ignoring the seatbelt sign that had just turned off after turbulence. He stood, muttered an apology to the couple, and stepped into the aisle. He made his way to the lavatory, shutting the door behind him. It was cramped, the overhead light harsh. He saw his reflection in the mirror, eyes wide and bloodshot. He splashed cold water on his face, adrenaline buzzing in his veins. Alone in that tiny space, he whispered, "I don't know who you are or what you want, but I can't do this anymore. Just leave me alone." The sound of his own voice reverberating in such a tight space sent a shiver through him. He half expected a response, but silence pressed in. He took several deep breaths, mentally preparing himself to go back to his seat. He couldn't hide in the lavatory for the rest of the flight. He returned to his row, feeling the curious gazes of other passengers on him. The couple scooted aside to let him in. He mumbled a thanks. He noted that the seat behind him was still empty, unchanged. He told himself to endure, to focus on the logic that the seat was physically empty, and no one else saw or heard anything. He recalled the counselor's words. Sometimes confronting your fear head-on, acknowledging it without giving it power, can help disarm it. He decided to do exactly that. He turned and looked directly at the seat behind him, letting his eyes take in every detail. It was just a seat, plain upholstery, no sign of occupant or movement. For a moment he felt a quiet victory, as if he had exposed the presence for the illusion it was. But in the space between heartbeats, he thought he saw the seat's fabric indent, as though someone placed a hand there. He blinked hard, and it was gone. His courage wavered. Still, he forced himself to remain facing it, refusing to cower. If something was there, he would face it. He stared until his eyes burned, and yet nothing else happened. Finally, he turned around, exhaling shakily. The couple next to him seemed too absorbed in each other to notice. The flight continued, inching closer to its destination. The final hour was relatively calm, with only minor bumps. The presence felt subdued, or perhaps Carter's defiance had lessened its influence. When the pilot announced their descent, Carter felt tears of relief welling up. He would land soon. He would walk off the plane again and hopefully leave this nightmare behind. The wheels touched down with a firm jolt, and the cabin erupted in chatter as people powered on devices, unbuckling seatbelts. Carter sat still for a moment, collecting himself, letting the wave of relief wash over him. When the aisle cleared enough for him to stand, he retrieved his carry-on, gave the couple a polite nod, and stepped off the plane without looking back at that seat. In the terminal, he experienced the same bright lights and background clamor that had greeted him so many months ago. He took a moment to breathe, then quickly made his way out. In the taxi, he considered calling Linda or texting Tracy, but decided to wait until he was calmer. He stared out at passing traffic, reeling from the knowledge that the presence might never fully vanish. It didn't haunt him constantly, but it appeared in vulnerable moments, especially during flights. Over the following weeks, he wrestled with the reality that he might carry this haunting presence indefinitely, a manifestation of trauma or something else. He continued seeing a counselor, digging deeper into the reasons behind his anxiety, exploring whether unresolved guilt or sadness from his past gave this presence power. He practiced meditation, mindfulness, and journaling to maintain his mental health. Sometimes, in the quiet of night, he heard echoes of that whisper, "You can't leave me behind." But he reminded himself that he had a choice, that he wasn't powerless. He never again experienced something as intense as that first flight, when the seat beside him truly felt inhabited. Yet the memory remained a scar in his mind. Over time, he built a life that included acceptance, Perhaps the presence was an echo of his own insecurities, or perhaps it was a restless spirit that found a channel in his vulnerability. Either way, he refused to let it dominate him. He traveled less by plane, preferring trains or road trips when possible, but he didn't shut himself away from life. He discovered that fear could be a teacher, forcing him to confront what he was running from. Months later, while browsing in a bookstore, he came across a section of supernatural accounts and ghost stories. A particular title caught his eye: Hauntings at High Altitude. Intrigued, he flipped through it. It contained various anecdotes from flight attendants and pilots who claimed to have encountered apparitions or heard voices in empty seats. His pulse quickened. Some described seatbelts that moved on their own, or glimpses of shadowy figures in reflection. A pang of recognition shot through him. Here was written proof that others had witnessed experiences similar to his own. It didn't confirm or deny anything, but it gave him a sense that he wasn't alone in his torment. He bought the book, read it at night with a mixture of fascination and dread. The stories varied in credibility, some sounding outlandish, others eerily familiar. Some speculated that souls lost in past crashes lingered in the skies. Others posited more psychological explanations. Yet each narrative reflected a shared truth. Certain encounters can't be easily dismissed, even if they can't be proven. He closed the book late at night, heart racing but strangely comforted. In time, Carter found a way to coexist with his memory of that flight. He never became fearless, but he learned to walk alongside his fear. Occasionally, he and Tracy corresponded, joking that maybe the next time they met it would be on a haunted bus rather than a haunted plane. She eventually moved to another city, and their contact grew sporadic. But the bond formed in that shared ordeal lingered. Many years passed before Carter stepped onto another plane alone. This time it was for a friend's wedding. He boarded the aircraft, and as always, that old tension flared up. He took a window seat, glancing to see if the seat next to him was occupied. A young man with headphones slid in, giving him a cursory nod. Carter settled in with a breath of relief. The flight was normal, no flickers or whispers. He stared at the clouds outside, pondering how the sky could be both breathtakingly beautiful and terrifyingly mysterious. The seat next to him was not empty, and he felt no unwelcome presence. That calm flight was perhaps the greatest gift he could have received. It didn't erase the past, but it showed him that flights could still be ordinary and even comforting. He never forgot the original incident, nor the second time he heard that forlorn voice. But he learned to live with the unresolved questions. If the presence truly existed, it might never let him go entirely. Yet he had discovered his own resilience, the power to face the unknown without fully yielding to terror. On restless nights, he sometimes dreamt of that seat, the brush of a hand, the whisper of his name. But each time, he awoke in his own bed, alive and safe. And so he moved forward, carrying the memory of an empty seat that was anything but empty. He had no final answers, only the knowledge that sometimes the boundaries of what we perceive are not as fixed as we believe. The sense of being watched, the brush of something unseen, might hold deeper truths about our fears and regrets, but he refused to let it define him, choosing instead to keep living, keep traveling, and keep believing that even in the darkest corners of our journey, we hold the capacity to endure.